Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Logicalis Emerging Trends in the Cyber Threat Landscape webinar. I'm really pleased and excited to be here with you this afternoon. Thank you very much for attending. We've got some really exciting content for you this afternoon. I'm going to be joined by our guest speaker from Trend Micro this afternoon. I'm going to introduce him in a minute. And we're going to be talking about a number of different topics that are kind of burning in the people's minds right now, and they're very topical in terms of the concerns that people have as they go forward with their cybersecurity journey. So, in terms of an agenda for today, I'm going to set the scene for you. I'm going to take the first section, and then I'm going to hand you over to Lewis. I'm going to introduce him in a moment, and he's going to take you through the middle two sections, which are what are we navigating, what are we seeing, and what can you do? And then I'm going to wrap up with the final section with so how can Logicalis help you? So before we get into it, what I'd like to do is to introduce you to my colleague Lewis Duke, who is he's the SecOps Risk and Threat Intelligence Lead for Trend Micro. Hi Lewis, how are you doing?
Hi James, yeah, very well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. Thank you very much for joining us and providing your insights today. I'm really excited to see how this is going to go. Now, but before we get into that, I understand that last week you were in attendance at the Trend Micro World Tour event. That's awesome. How did that go? Have you got any kind of particular insights or comments that you'd like to share from that event?
Yeah, certainly. It was a really interesting event. Quite interesting. Some of the topics we'll touch on today, actually, but quite importantly, it was interesting listening to how businesses are trying to get that proactive approach to security, right? Trying to outpace the threat actors, and ultimately, the conversations around the room all tie into risk, which is really nice to see that as an industry that we are getting there in terms of risk conversation.
Excellent. No, fantastic. And whilst the technology is it's the shiny stuff that people want to fix everything, it's also the pain points that people have because they're not necessarily feeling like they're getting that return on investment because they either don't know what to do with the technology or they don't know how to drive it or they don't have time to drive it. So it's not just about the technology, it's about the process and people. And when it comes to risk and risk management, it goes beyond just the technology.
Absolutely.
So I guess, right, well, without further ado, let's get into it. I'll come back to Lewis shortly, but I'll kind of do a little bit here to set the scene for you. So in terms of where the market is and what the industry is seeing and what our customers are seeing, the threat landscape is always evolving. We know that, but it's evolving more quickly than it ever has done before. And whilst it's great to be able to have the tooling in place and maybe some process and hopefully some people to be able to defend against those threats that are out there, you want to be able to remove yourself from a reactive state to a more proactive state. And certainly when you are trying to address risk, you're looking at it from a risk management perspective. What's the way in which you used to measure risk, or how you should be measuring risk? It's based on impact and likelihood. What's the likelihood of something happening? What's the impact of that thing happening? And that impact is becoming greater because that likelihood is also increasing. It's not just a case of if you're going to get hit, it's when. And now, of course, with the advent of AI, which is absolutely amazing, and there's so much that businesses can do to enable themselves and become more proactive and grow. At the same time, there's concerns. What are the bad aspects of AI? How could threat actors be using AI? What do we need to be looking out for? And of course, when it comes to risk management and understanding your exposure, understanding what visibility you have in your security estate, what vulnerabilities you have, how do you prioritize where you focus your efforts so that you ultimately reduce that exposure? These are all things that link into each other, and people are trying to get a better handle on. And of course, with AI, when you're now dealing with things at machine speed, if you take that kind of NIST instant response cycle, where you're looking to detect, respond, contain, and then hopefully recover, with AI working for you and against you, these numbers are coming down by an order of magnitude. So what you want to be able to do is to be able to move from that reactive state to a more proactive state so that you can stay ahead. So in terms of the market view, Gartner is absolutely going to have a view. They always have done, they always will do. And what we're seeing is the amount of information security spending that is set to grow globally by 15% in 2025. So year on year, there's this massive increase of security spending. And that's really interesting because from a C-suite and CISO perspective, they're now under increasing pressure to be able to deliver against those cybersecurity objectives or mandates that they have for the business that they operate in. So there's this kind of struggle between spending more and then being able to make sure that you meet your security targets. But of course, it doesn't mean that organizations still aren't being hit anyway. So we have a series here in front of you. These are 5 of some of the biggest cyber attacks from 2024, and there's a couple of common themes in here. There's a number of UK organizations that you can see listed, and we can see that there's some recurring themes in terms of why they were hit or how they were hit. So ransomware was a massive factor, and then of course extortion through the demand for ransom payments. And this has led to a number of organizations. This led to a number of organizations being affected in a negative way, and we can see that the different types of threat actor that has been that's been involved in these attacks. So we've got cyber criminal gangs, we've got foreign state threat actors, and then of course we've got the notorious script kiddie. If we bring that up to the current day, right onto the bleeding edge, there's attacks on retail that we're seeing in the past few weeks that can't have escaped people's attention. It would be remiss of us not to at least acknowledge that these things have been happening. So, of course, we can see that we've got a number of different attacks in retail, and the case in point, the co-op is something that was kind of something I've seen personally. You've gone into the shop maybe 3 times in the last couple of weeks to get your lunch, and the shelves are empty. And that's not because these organizations have been doing anything wrong, they've just been hit. So the impact is more tangible to the public because the public sees it, it's more visible to them. And this is something that is an awful experience for any of these organizations to go through. But it just goes to show that the threat actors are merciless in their advances. In terms of what the market is seeing from a customer perspective, we survey over 1,000 global CIOs each year, and we produce this report, the CIO Report, and we condense this down into a number of meaningful statistics. But as you can see here through the middle column, under the cybersecurity threats, absolutely every single one of them, 96%, recognize there's a need for better security coverage. So they're concerned about the visibility, they're concerned about their ability to respond, detect, and be able to contain and then ultimately recover. But at the same time, 50% of them, at least half of them, think that they've overinvested. They're not necessarily seeing that return on investment for the spend that they've made. So at this point, actually, what I'd like to do is introduce a poll. We have a poll question that we'd like to ask you. It's one of a couple, and we'd like to ask you, what are you most concerned about with regards to emerging threats that are out there? So feel free to navigate to the right-hand side of your screen, and you should be able to see that poll and click on the answer. So at this point, what I'd like to do is, whilst we kind of recognise that we've got the CIOs that need better security coverage, but they reckon that half of them reckon they've overinvested. It's not necessarily that they have overinvested, but you might need to understand a bit more. Well, where should I be focusing those efforts? Where should I be placing my spend so that I can get a better security posture? So, Lewis, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, James. Really, really interesting, actually. So, as you can imagine, with somebody who's got threat intelligence in their role, it's interesting when you're looking at that investment in security to understand the return of investment. You need to be spending it wisely. So, you need to be, taking an intelligence-led strategy. You need to be aware of the risks that you and your organization are facing, so that when you're investing, and ultimately spending that money, you're putting it in the right place, which is really key. Otherwise, we do end up in a situation, I'm sure we've all worked for or with organizations where there's been certain controls in place, but it doesn't map back to a risk ultimately. So yeah, very, very topical and on point, James.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. So, well, I mean, at this point, Lewis, is probably a good time to hand over to your good self, because I'd like to understand more about what it is you're seeing, and what are the considerations that we need to make in terms of these emerging threats in the cyber landscape.
Absolutely, yeah. Perfect. So thanks, James. Yeah, so I'm just going to kind of cover off a little bit around, what are we navigating? Everyone talks around the threat landscape and how it's evolving, and I think that's a really important part to kind of focus on to start with. It's this evolution of an attack surface and threat actors. It's not a revolution. But that being said, we are at a kind of unique point in time where there's a hell of a lot that's going on, and that's impacting not just the cyber threat landscape, but just the overall geo landscape, shall we say. We can look at the advances in technology, and I'll go into a little bit more detail specifically around AI. Very topical at the moment. There's been huge advances over the last 12 months, 18 months. And even if we look back even longer, the advances are continuing to come thick and fast. One of the big changes that we often don't give enough airtime, I think, is how we interact. If I go back, I've been in the industry for a number of years, but if we think back even just 5 years ago, this working from a home office, interacting with businesses in the way that we do was unheard of. So just the way that we interact and consume technology is another massive factor. And then the last point, as James has said with the attacks on retail, it'd be remiss of us not to touch on some of the key geopolitical changes in the current world, and the potential impacts they might have. And I'm not going to go into any of these in any particular depth, but what's really important to note is that at the moment we have a number of different tensions and conflicts, that as just everyday businesses, as everyday people, consumers, we're all aware of, but what we might not be aware of is how that can and might impact our businesses and our daily lives. And of course, on top of all of that, the cyber criminal underground, they never rest, and we're dealing at the moment. This is not just UK. Some of the suspected threat actors behind this are now over in the US, also wreaking havoc. The cyber criminal element that's there, it never rests. Okay, so it's always there waiting to prey on those that are vulnerable, and it's something that we can never discount. But when we look at that geopolitical landscape and the tensions and conflicts that are ongoing, what does it actually mean to us in the security profession, and how might it impact us and our businesses? Well, the first one's pretty obvious, right? It's that nation state element. And I think we're pretty well versed as an industry now to understand that when it comes to nation states, ultimately, the power that they bring behind them, to be able to withstand a nation state sponsored attack, you've got to be, extremely mature in your security posture. But what we're likely to see, and I'm sure without doubt is currently happening, that they are being leveraged for the likes of disruption, disinformation, absolutely, definitely going on, but trying to, as it says there, trying to exert some of that political pressure without direct conflict. What we don't want to see is that escalation in conflict. Same as any nation state, they'd rather keep that lower velocity of attack. Where it starts to get really interesting is the knock-off effect of that. So when we see these conflicts, what typically happens is we then see this uptick in activist groups and politically motivated groups then trying to get their voices heard. So a lot of the time it's disruptive. Graffitiing, effectively digital graffitiing. But often what can happen in terms of the broader industry is it's not necessarily you or your business that gets hit, but it's your supply chain. So, very, very prominent when we look at the cyber ecosystems these days that any organization has built up. It's very, very complex, very complicated, and there are a number of different facets to it. So it might not just be, your business that might be targeted, but it's everything within that supply chain that can then have that knock-on effect. And lastly, spillover. I mean, conflict spillover, I've probably put this as a little bit harsh because it's not necessarily all the conflict. Spillover can happen from any kind of activity. But this is a real threat that we should all be aware of. If we look back to certainly the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we saw a mass kind of explosion of so-called wiper malware. That was introduced in an effort to try and have a destructive impact. And that was on both sides. That wasn't one side or the other. That was both sides used the same sort of technology. And we saw, spillover. The malware wasn't designed to only target specific systems. It was a destructive worm. Go in, cause as much havoc as you like. And obviously, that knows no boundaries. A bit of code doesn't know where the machine it's attacking is sitting. So there was spillover there. There was also things where we saw, again, in today's connected world, it's very easy to think, well, how can we cause a disruption? Well, we'll do comms, disrupt communications. And that's actually what the Russians did. They targeted Viasat, so satellite communications provider, ultimately to disrupt Ukrainian communications. But actually with that came collateral damage and the spillover, where we saw users of ISPs in Europe having services knocked out. And actually more dramatically, we saw a German energy company whose monitoring systems for their solar farms were actually utilizing that Viasat technology for the monitoring. So they had no visibility and no way of monitoring that energy supply. So again, it's not always, an attacker coming and targeting you and your entity that's the biggest threat. There is always the kind of other areas that we need to be looking at and just have a kind of perspective. And as James has alluded to, a lot of it comes down to risk and risk management. So understanding those risks so you can understand what may or may not be brought to arms against you. I wanted to dive a little bit more into the tech advancements as well. This is really relevant, I think, for me, I've grown up both with and without the internet. But if we look at how technology has advanced over time, and you can see here, between paper and the first printing press, it's 75 generations. You think, gosh, that's incredible. How did it take so long? And then from there, it's just picking up pace. 16 generations to the typewriter, one generation between TV and computers. This is getting very, very condensed. And if we actually extend that out further and look at, the technology that we all love, I should imagine, or certainly hate to love to hate when it comes to cybersecurity. If we look at the kind of infrastructure, the networks and environments that we're trying to protect, if you look at how quickly they have evolved, it's absolutely incredible. Just to think that we've gone from, discovering the internet and email now to ChatGPT, and you just think how quickly we've gone from basic generative AI tools now to agentic AI, where we've got AI bots and agents that are there actually proactively taking actions. So I can't wait to see how this slide will look in the next 10 years when we look at the future advancements that are no doubt coming around the corner that we've not yet thought of. But if we look at this, I mean, all we're looking at here is effectively just a top-down view of an exponential curve, right? So, if we look at those advancements, we can kind of predict that it's only going to get, more and more kind of condensed in terms of how quickly we're bringing out new technologies. And why do I mention how quick it is? Why am I talking around how long it takes between these advancements? Well, ultimately, it's because we as security professionals are there to defend, right? So we have an environment and a threat landscape to navigate and defend our organizations, our customers, our stakeholders against. And when we look at how we do that, we've had to keep pace, right? We've got to outpace the attacker. Ultimately, that is our job, and we've had to do that, around AI. In the poll question, there's a number of different threats that come from AI. We've got to be able to not only foresee those and try and put some protections in, but also then start looking, how do we safely enable our users to use it? And I'm sure everyone, watching this will no doubt know that the more you try and regulate and prevent somebody from using something, they will always try and find a way around it. So if you turn around and say, you cannot use this technology, it'll just end up being pushed somewhere where you don't have visibility of it. So it's very, very key that as an organizations, we look at these advances in technology, and as I say, keep pace, outpace the attackers, but ensure that we can use those, leverage those for our business outcomes in a positive way, whilst keeping them secure. We've seen this in cloud computing. Obviously, basically now any customer I speak to is somewhere on a cloud journey, whether they've lifted and shifted, whether they're doing cloud native, infrastructure as code, whatever that might be. We're all somewhere along that journey. But if we think back, that was relatively new and we had to keep pace. Some of the other advancements, 5G, IoT, connected networks, something that changes the game is, again, it's a completely different kind of attack surface that ultimately leads to a potential gap for an attacker to get into a network and then wreak havoc. And that brings me on to this point. So in general, we've got these advancements in technology, which is fantastic. But what it's actually brought along is a complexity, not just in those advancements themselves, but in the way that our organizations, our networks, our environments are now connected. When we look at the environments that we are trying to defend, we're trying to protect, we're trying to keep running smoothly, they're no longer simple. The amount of different connected applications, most of us are now multi-cloud. We're not using just one provider. We've also got some on-prem. It's such a complex environment, and the more we advance in technology, these environments are only going to kind of increase in complexity. So we've got to be really careful that we understand the risk of our environments, and that means understanding that environment and knowing it, which is something that's really, really key. And then just kind of looking towards the future, I'm sure everyone's heard some of the kind of worst case scenarios, how quantum computing is going to come, and the day it becomes mainstream, all our current cryptography is done for, and threat actors now can just steal data and decrypt it later on. And obviously, for those of you who know a bit about quantum computing, there's a lot more to it than that, but it is something we need to be aware of. The next big advancement in technology is around the corner, whether it's quantum computing or whether we end up down another altogether different route. Who can say? But again, just kind of alluding to the fact that this is changing, and as security professionals, we must have our eyes looking forward in terms of not only how can we protect it, but how can we leverage it ourselves. As James alluded to, we're not the only ones using AI. Attackers are using it, but we're using it for good as well. Excuse me. So that's kind of a little bit of, what are we navigating? It's pretty complex, right? There's a lot going on. But as a security vendor, what are we seeing? Is it all doom and gloom? And I'd like to say quite happily, no, it's not. It's not all doom and gloom at all. Bear with me. Um, excuse me. What we're seeing is actually, again, to my earlier point, we're not seeing a revolution in threat actors. We're not seeing a revolution in the way they're gaining access into their campaigns. All we're seeing is this evolution. I think it's in our nature to get excited about the latest trends, about how AI is going to create new malware that we've never seen before, 0 days, new techniques that are coming on the market for threat actors to leverage. But ultimately, what it comes down to is it most of the time is still basic. So we still see some of the main causes of breaches. It's down to MFA not being enabled, endpoints without protection. It's the basics, basic cyber hygiene. But what we are seeing is, there is adoption in the latest technologies and specifically AI. We are seeing it being leveraged by threat actors. But what's quite interesting is it's not in the way that maybe a lot of us foresaw. So although there was an awful lot of, in my opinion, hyperbole around AI is going to come and change the world, and there's nothing we can do about it. We've got generative AI creating code, new malware. That's not what happens. We actually had an interview with a ransomware group, and they reckon that AI contributes to about a fifth of their operation. And actually, they're using it in the same way that we are also using it. They're using it as augmenting their capabilities and for guidance. And the kind of the use cases that we're seeing is for helping write code, not ultimately completely write code. There is still prompts, but this is a bit of SoundCloud written by AI. We're seeing it helping them make their tools more user friendly. So, when it comes to things like phishing campaigns, we're seeing them getting more effective, not because of anything in particular, but just because, if you think back 5 years ago, you'd be able to spot a phishing mail because it was either from a Nigerian prince telling you were suddenly rich, which was fantastic, or there were things in there. There was the bad grammar. It was sent at suspicious times. Whereas nowadays, it's very, very easy for a threat actor to say, hey, make a message up in their native language and then translate that. So ultimately, it's better for targeting. Some of the other interesting stuff that we've seen, as you would, no doubt imagine, I hope a lot of you are aware of, they have their own version of, Worm GPT, so Chat GPT without the guardrails. I find it quite interesting that they're able to remove the guardrails, but they still don't put a spell checker in it. But effectively, what we've got now is attackers can use these LLMs. And whereas if you ask Copilot, how do I make a firebomb at home? Hopefully it'll say, I can't tell you that. Certainly mine does. I did test the theory. But ultimately, there are no guardrails on these models. So they are able to kind of assist them. Now, what that's doing is it's not changing anything dramatically in the grand scheme of things. It's not suddenly making the threat actors that are already out there any more sophisticated. What it does do, though, is somewhat even the field. So some of the lower level threat actors, the so-called script kiddies, maybe, they will have, if they're buying access to some of these tools, you can buy some of these for $250 and you can get access to one of these jailbroken GPTs. And what that'll give you then is just access to the information that maybe you wouldn't have had before unless you had specific contacts with the industry. So it's more of a field leveler and upskilling rather than anything game changing. But still quite interesting to see how it's kind of a cat and mouse thing where defenders are using AI tools for good and threat actors using it for evil, however you look at it. But quite interesting to see how that interaction is changing. What I find quite interesting is deepfakes, and I'll start this by saying this is the worst we'll ever see it as well. If you think about the way that the technology is advancing, it's kind of the world eating snake. Feed it in what enables you to pick up that it's a deepfake. X, Y, and Z, perfect. Feed that into the tools to then develop the next iteration that hopefully wouldn't be picked up. So, deepfakes are only going to get better. But what's interesting is the way that threat actors leverage them. So, back to the very beginning, when we look at politically motivated, potentially, we saw, and this was a couple of years ago now, but audio of Sakir Starmer, where there was actually a couple of different clips released, effectively just trying to tarnish his reputation ultimately. But again, something quite low velocity in terms of a threat in actors' actions, but ultimately can have quite far-reaching effects. So very interesting to see that particular use case. I'm sure a lot of you on the call are aware of this particular incident. So this is where we had a relatively junior member of an organisation ended up in a Teams call with who he thought was his CFO. Actually, there was a couple of other people on the call as well who, again, were all actually fake participants. And in the end, the ultimate outcome was that business lost 25 million. It was transferred, and the employee thought they were doing the right thing. Now, again, quite interesting how this is the worst it'll be, and we can already convince people to part with £25 million or $25 million, I should say. So it's quite interesting when we think about, okay, well, how is AI going to change that threat landscape, and what do we, as the defenders, need to be thinking about? It's okay. Well, do we have controls in place for this sort of attack? Always thinking, okay, what's the risk? Could somebody do that in my environment? Are the checks in place to ensure that one employee can't just go $25 million? Yep, I'll sign that off. Again, just a little bit of thought-provoking kind of insight there from my perspective. On a more personal level, this is horrific, but it is something that we are seeing. So again, this is less at a business level, but could be used. If we think about kind of blackmail for maybe access to certain resources. But yeah, deepfake a child's voice to then let's say blackmail a parent. So in this particular instance, it was for money. But yeah, you can think about how that could be leveraged to other means within the security industry. And again, this is the worst it's going to. The least convincing is probably a better way to say it. The least convincing it'll ever be, and we're already seeing some big impacts here. The last thing I want to touch on deepfakes is this KnowBe4, and credit to KnowBe4 for actually being transparent with this and kind of talking about it. But this comes back to the way that we interact with technology, how we consume it, and how that's ultimately influenced our business processes. So this particular story, if you're not aware of it, is we had a chap in North Korea, not a nice guy, who effectively applied for a job at KnowBe4. Ended up doing an video interview. It was a deepfake content that they used. Got the job. Never actually saw anybody in person. Was successful in the job application. Got the job. And subsequently had their laptop from KnowBe4 sent out to a US address in Central America. And it ended up actually being that address was a server farm. And that particular device was plugged in, and thankfully, due to the security controls KnowBe4 had in place, they were alerted to this. But ultimately, what happened here was they were compromised, and somebody was able to bypass all of their typical security to get access to a network. And in this particular instance, the chap on the right is the guy's LinkedIn profile, who was ultimately kind of imitated to get the role. But again, real interesting in terms of when you think about the risk of cybersecurity. A lot of us think, oh, maybe it's firewalls, but there's actually a hell of a lot more to it than that. This is just a simple recruitment process that led to have somebody have hands on a keyboard. And if we then link that back into things like AI tool sets, I'm sure most of us here within our businesses either have access to or trialing certain AI toolings, Copilot, for example. You've got now, well, what if that person hadn't plugged it into a server farm and had actually logged onto that laptop, maybe before using Copilot, maybe some of their permissions weren't quite correct within SharePoint, and all of a sudden, instead of having to do reconnaissance, this North Korean threat actor could have gone and trawl through a load of data they shouldn't have access to, and Copilot will spit that out in 30-60 seconds rather than days, weeks of interrogation trying to understand the network that they're in. So again, it's just about thinking about, okay, well, when we look at how the technology shifted, what else is it also enabling outside of maybe the obvious? And that kind of leads me back to kind of full circle. What can you do? We're all here as security professionals with hopefully everyone who's attending it is here on the correct side of defending organizations from potential threat actors. But there's a couple of things that you can do within your organizations. The first couple I'm going to cover are quite high level, but it's ultimately where it starts, right? And that's with leadership. I think certainly from my experience, security is now where it needs to be in terms of it is now obviously a board level risk, and we have buy-in from leadership. I think that was the first step that's taken us a while to get to. But again, from my experience, most organizations are now there, but we need that buy-in at the top. And purely because from the second part, it's around an alignment to business objectives. Far too often, and it kind of comes back to James's point around when we look at people who feel they've overinvested, but still feel they need to invest more to get the security. Well, it's aligning your business needs and your security needs together. Having the mindset to understand exactly what your business needs to run and therefore the unique threats it might face will gear you up to make a much more relevant investment and be able to actually articulate that return of investment. On this point, I always like to say, as security professionals, most of us will say we'd prefer to have the most secure environments possible, but obviously that means turning the laptops off, turning the servers off, and fantastic, nobody can get breached, but that doesn't enable you to conduct your business. So it's always this fine line, but ultimately with leadership and this alignment, what we should have is a much more clear and consistent way of investing in security. And then again, from this kind of high level, and I class it here as the foundation, is then understanding the governance that's required. And with that, that can be anything from the guardrails you're employing, the frameworks you're going to adopt, the compliance and audit metrics that you need, obviously within your particular industry, within your sector. But tying all these three together gives you that fantastic foundation to then go out and tackle the security problem. And then it comes to building that security posture. I can't stress this enough. Basic cyber hygiene is by far and away the number one thing that any organization can get right to have the biggest impact to their security posture. We're all, I think, somewhat guilty, of tagging on to the next best technology, the shiny. But ultimately, it's 2025 and we're still talking around, a lot of the major breaches can be traced back to these basic hygiene steps. It does go further than you think. It might not be sexy, it might not sell, but it definitely does keep you more secure and will keep you out of the media. So yeah, basic cyber hygiene, please do implement that as a priority. Secondly is awareness, right? So attending this webinar, looking at the threat landscape, it's all about being aware. And it kind of goes two steps. So as a business, you need to be aware of the risks that are being brought to arms against you so that you can then obviously ensure that you've got appropriate mitigations in place to defend against those. But it goes one step further. It's not just you as a business that needs to understand. Your users are also need to understand the risks that apply to them. And it's something that I quite passionate about. For all my years in security, I've always heard people say, "Oh, users are the weakest link," and they can be. Don't get me wrong, they can be, but they can also be your strongest defense. They are the barriers. If you look at any threat actor, ultimately what they want is an identity that they can escalate the privilege of to carry out whatever their motivations are. And obviously, behind every identity is a user. It's you. It's me sitting behind a keyboard, and that awareness is what ultimately arms them to win that battle against the threat actors. And then my last point here is about leveraging partnerships. So, no organization has to do it alone. And again, I think as an industry, we have been somewhat blinkered. We've been guardians. We're protecting our organizations. But as you look at, simply, if we just look at the tech advances, no organization has all the answers at all the times. That we look at how quickly that tech has evolved. We've now got niche specialism skill sets that are required in various different elements. It's not a bad thing if you can't do it alone. James mentioned Gartner. If we look at the stats around services, it's only going one way. It's growing as organizations look to augment their current skills gaps. Please do ensure that you're leveraging those trusted partnerships. So no organization should be alone in the battle against the wider threat landscape, shall we say. And I think that's everything from me. So I think now's a good time to hand back over to James.
Thanks very much, Lewis. That was great. Really insightful, really interesting. And I found that incredibly valuable. Thank you very much. So I think we've got the results of the first poll in, and that might be worth understanding what people's thoughts were, because we've got a couple of questions that we wanted to ask. So we asked, what is your primary security concern regarding AI? And looks like we've got a pretty strong lead there with employees putting information into AI that they shouldn't be, that's inappropriate. So that's quite a common concern. Whilst AI or the promise of AI can get you the answer to everything or anything, should it be doing that? And whilst businesses want to become AI enabled, they first have to be AI ready. And in doing so, having not only the technology to be able to deliver those outcomes in place, but also the governance and the process, which for many organizations means not going back to square one, but before you have the new shiny thing that you want to go after, then you might need to have some of the basics in place first, or at least understand where are you on that kind of journey towards being AI ready. So this is talking about understanding what data you have, where is it, has it been classified, what's your classification policy, how do you apply your labeling to that data, so your kind of sensitivity labels, and then how do you apply any controls that you might have or need to have in terms of understanding or governing how data flows in and out of the organization. Now, this isn't anything new, but because of these tools being able to do absolutely anything with the data that you provide them, you want to make sure that the data they have is appropriate. And of course, that also means the use of AI tools outside of your organization. So, Lewis, I don't know if you've got any particular thoughts on that with regards to the inappropriate use of or data being fed in.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I wonder if anyone's answer will have changed after that presentation, and I talked around deepfakes. But yeah, certainly, I think as you mentioned, organisations that I speak to, a lot of them are currently still working on how do they put a policy in place to kind of manage that risk. Ultimately, I think the best thing that organizations can do is to permit, as I say, that the more you tend to hide technology away, so companies who take a policy of block usage of AI, I feel will just end up with it coming back to bite. As an ex-techie, if I can't do something, we find ways around it, right? We try and solve our problems. That's the way our brains work. Well, how do I do it this way then? And that ultimately, comes away from that visibility piece. So, I think the main thing around any kind of usage of AI is ultimately that organizations need to gain visibility of it in the first steps, and then obviously have those policies and guardrails in place to follow.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. So, what I'd like to do is maybe kind of segues nicely actually into looking at or understanding some of the ways in which we as Logicalis might be able to help you and help our customers. So we're talking about understanding your posture, understanding your potential exposure, and then what that means in terms of your ability to be able to then detect and then to contain, respond and contain, and then recover if you need to. And to kind of visualize that a little bit, we've got a couple of slides here. I recognize this is a really busy one. For other presentations we have with customers, I can spend 20 minutes going through this. But its focus point is really talking about SOC and incident response maturity levels. But it certainly speaks to the realm of risk management, cyber risk and exposure management, and understanding what does your attack surface look like? What are the potential attack paths that a threat actor could use against you and your infrastructure in order to achieve their goal? So I'm not going to describe all the pieces that are on this slide, but what it's intending to show you, and this is how we set the scene when we're speaking to our organizations, is that you typically start on the left-hand side in terms of that level of maturity. You build your infrastructure, you get the business operational, you start running with it. But then as not necessarily as an afterthought, but then how do you weave security in? It doesn't necessarily get done at the beginning, so you have to kind of mature your posture, and you have to keep doing that. You can't stand still, otherwise you plateau, and then you start to create more exposure as a result. So the key thing I'd like to kind of draw your attention to is the black curved line, which is the kind of curve of that maturity, the ability for an organization to be able to detect and then respond in terms of that incident management, that incident response posture. So whether this is something they're doing themselves with an internal security team, or maybe they have their own SOC, or perhaps through the outsourcing of a managed security service like we provide to our organizations. As you become more and more mature, you're doing potentially more of the things that you can see inside of the green boxes there. Now, whilst we can see there's 5 pillars of this maturity scale, the stuff that's over on the far right-hand side, this is borderline aspirational. This is going to be for those organizations that are at the top of that maturity scale. They've got all the people, all the technology, all the process, all the governance in place. So they're absolutely doing absolutely everything they can right. Or perhaps the controls needed to be able to address those items that you can see towards the right are really narrow, really specific, low-level operations that not everybody's doing first. Those are the things that are coming last. And all the things that you can see in green, these are all the things that Logicalis can help you with and have conversations with you about, whether that's helping you understand your as-is state. Where are you now? Where are you trying to get to? Help build out a roadmap. Or is it kind of more about implementing a solution, helping you to realize some of those outcomes that you're after? And whether or not that is just an implementation of something, maybe getting something tidied up, or is it potentially something you're looking to outsource with those challenges that we speak to our customers all the time about, in terms of being able to provide that 24/7, 365 response. Now, that's all well and good in terms of all the things that are possible, but very often, and unfortunately is the case, a lot of the times we'll speak to an organization and it's really only when you boil it down, the items in red is about as far as they've got. Now, it's not to say that they're doing anything wrong or incorrectly or badly. It's just they're not necessarily sure which direction do I go in next. Where do I spend my next security pound, as it were? So it kind of goes back to that investment and choosing wisely, and helping to understand that is something that we can help you with. So how can we help you right now? Well, in fact, to support this endeavor, we've been talking about cyber risk. We've been talking about exposure, talking about understanding, well, where are we now, and what's the potential impact that we could have based on some of these attacks that we're seeing out in the wild. What we've done is we've prepared a 25 question survey that we're going to invite you to fill out. We're going to drop you the link into the chat in a moment's time. It's really simple. It's really easy. It takes 10 minutes of your time. And what this is going to do is we'll be able to provide you back a really glossy 7-page report, which will go into a level of detail, actually, based on the responses that you're giving to your cyber risk exposure position. So we'll be touching on areas like asset discovery and visibility, threat prediction and attack path awareness, risk prioritization and contextual decision making, compliance and governance alignment, and risk quantification and remediation effectiveness. So the idea is that this is not just a technology survey. This touches on technology, process, and people. So we'll drop the link in. We'd readily invite you to fill that out. As I say, it's dead easy, 10 minutes, and we really hope it'll be worth your time to do that. If that goes well, and there's something, a further conversation that you'd perhaps like to have with us, or maybe want to speak to Trend Micro in terms of what they can help you with in terms of what your desired outcomes are, or maybe wanting to understand a little bit more about how you can get better visibility of your security estate, how to understand your vulnerabilities and your overall posture more readily, and then be able to then prioritize where you focus those efforts a little bit more. We've got a number of security assessments that we can work with you and Trend through those programs to help kind of start to deliver some of those outcomes for you. So at this point, I think I will, or one of my colleagues will, arrange to drop the link to the readiness assessment into the chat for you. I'm not sure if we have any questions for a Q&A at this stage that we could have a look at. Excuse me while I get a little.
Yeah, no, I can see there's a couple of questions there. So yeah, I'll happily take those. So first one, what are the most common gaps that we see in organisations' incident response plans related to new threat trends? Oh, hang on, and one's been put on the screen. There we go. Yeah, so in this one, actually the main thing that we see is the lack of implementation. So no plan survives first contact with the enemy. The most common gaps that we see is that incident response plans are not rehearsed. So they're fantastic on paper, but when they're actually brought into the firing line, when you're doing it at 2 a.m. on a Saturday morning, or whenever you've got that fantastic phone call, it doesn't work at that point. So yeah, my number one kind of take from that is please don't just do tabletop exercises. Please do rehearse any IR plans that you have.
Yep, absolutely makes sense.
Which emerge? Okay. Difficult given as we mentioned how quickly the advances are coming. One of my biggest concerns at the moment, one of the biggest impacts, is around the identity piece. So obviously not our rush, I think that's the wrong terminology, but in our desire to increase productivity and leverage the technologies around AI, I do think that we're giving individual identities a hell of a lot more power than maybe a lot of organizations and people realize. If you look at the power that something like just Copilot has, and yes, I know the security guardrails put around that, but even if you read the small print, it says provided your permissions are all correct, and a lot of organisations, if you go in and say, are your permissions 100% correct? Yeah, debatable. So I think that's probably one of the biggest threats, is how the identity, just general user identities, are going to become more and more powerful because of the links into AI. Is probably what I'll take away from that.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer.
Where information? What are the main attack vectors being used against universities? Okay, interesting. So in terms of higher education, just as a sector on its own, it's quite interesting when you look at the threats being brought against them. Obviously, there's quite a dichotomy of personas there. So there's an element of actually hacktivism, and kind of politically motivated, targeting students. They're at a more affluent, not the wrong term, they're more likely to be influenced at that period in their lives. So we do see a more targeting in that sense. But then actually, if you look at a kind of high level threat, higher education is ultimately one of the main targets for nation state when we look at espionage. We look at corporate espionage. If you look at some of the universities and some of the projects, the research that's being funded there, obviously that's an absolute gold mine. I'm not going to mention any particular states, but there is one that jumps to mind more than others when it comes to espionage and that stealing of secrets and then developing faster. So yeah, quite an interesting particular sector when it comes to threat actors. But yeah.
I'll take this one.
Go on then, James.
Okay. So what are the most effective ways to address cybersecurity fatigue and alert overload among security teams? Well, yeah, this is really topical. So this is speaking to organizations having multiple security tools in place. I mean, some statistics out there are saying that it's quite normal for organizations to have 50, 60, 70, 80 different tools doing all sorts of different things, but in a really siloed nature. So you've got tools that are potentially acting as technical controls and stopping things from happening, possibly alerting, certainly or hopefully generating some logging. But what are people doing about that? How many teams have you got looking at those alerts? What's the triage look like? How do those alerts relate to another system? And this becomes a nightmare for people that are trying to do their day job, but also kind of look after all the security stuff, right? So this is certainly a challenge that many organizations face, where they have data and alert fatigue. They've got alerts firing left, right, and center. They don't have the time or the expertise to be able to kind of detect what the actual issue is, shut it down, contain it, and then be able to kind of respond and remediate. So this plays really well into XDR. So this is it's not a technology, it's a methodology, a concept, if you will, where you can take all of your security tooling and assuming that they integrate and hopefully are then aligned to the MITRE attack framework, which is a common set of terminology for security professionals and vendors to be able to discuss and understand what the motivations are, what the intentions are for a threat actor, what is it they're trying to do in your environment. You're able to bring together all of the different alerts and the data that is being spat out of all of these tools and surface them in one place, have them correlated, have them normalized, so that you can get a much better idea of what the event, what the actual incident is, which might be made up of a number of different alerts within that incident. So you can get a much more contextualized idea of what's happening, and then that gives you a fighting chance, a much better chance to be able to deal with that. So security teams, in order to be able to deal with alert fatigue, data and alert fatigue, XDR is certainly a place to be looking. So you can get better visibility and you can start bringing down those detection times so that you can respond more effectively, reduce your investigation time, and then recover more quickly with hopefully less of an impact. So a couple of things. The link to the CREM readiness assessment has been dropped into the chat there, so feel free to, as I say, to register for that. It's 25 questions, 10 minutes. We promise you it will be worth it for the report that comes out. It's really good. And I think have we got the results of another poll? Here we are. So, how concerned are you about the rise in cyber attacks and the current threat landscape? So it looks like there's a bit of a split here. Okay, so certainly on you're concerned.
As long as no one's saying not aware or not concerned at all, that's the main thing there, the takeaway there.
So, okay, so kind of fair to middling, so a pragmatic view by the sounds of it. And I think that's the thing, isn't it? There's no such thing as 100% security. So the idea is that shift, that mindset to shift between a reactive state to a more proactive state. And in doing so, be better prepared to be able to deal with the thing when the thing happens. And hopefully, because the likelihood is going to be there, but the impact should be less. And then to round it all off, that speaks nicely to the whole concept of risk management. So with that, Lewis, thank you very much for your time today. That's been fantastic to have you on board and to hear your insights. Thank you for joining me. And thank you all for those that have attended this afternoon. Really pleased. And hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Cheers.